Throughout the centuries, there have been many barbaric and brutal executions that occurred at the hands of some of the most evil rulers and kings and queens that history has ever seen. For example, during the reign of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, he would order William Wallace, a Scottish rebel, known as Braveheart, to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Wallace was dragged through London behind a horse, and he was subjected to his harrowing ordeal in the land of his enemies. Henry VIII is remembered as a sixth-wifed monarch, who would sentence even two of his own wives to death inside the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn lost her head by a French swordsman, but Catherine Howard would not be so lucky, being forced to die by the commoner's axe within the walls of the infamous fortress. But during the reign of the terrifying Tudor monarch, there was one execution that haunted the thousands of people who attended and saw the poor man being boiled alive by a number of executioners. But it was the brutal will of King Henry VIII. Join us today as we look at the execution of the cook boiled alive by King Henry VIII. And as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Richard Roose was a cook who worked inside of the household of Bishop John Fisher. Fisher was a well-respected member of the church across England, but he would for some time encounter a significant amount of criticism and threat from Henry VIII. Richard Roose was a strong supporter of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of the king, who he wanted to divorce, and the king at this time had become infatuated and obsessed with Anne Boleyn. It was clear that the Pope would not grant the separation. Henry would eventually split from Rome and would declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England. But Bishop John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, would be incredibly outspoken against the king, and eventually Henry VIII would have enough and chop his head off. But in the afternoon of the 18th of February 1531, Bishop John Fisher was sat down with a number of guests in his home in Lambeth March in London. The guests were being fed, and many of them were people who had been invited in on behalf of John Fisher to share a meal as they were poor and suffering. However, it was said that, on the 18th day of February 1531, one Richard Roose of Rochester, cook, also called Richard Cook, did cast poison into a vessel full of yeast or balm, standing in the kitchen of the Bishop of Rochester's palace at Lambeth March, by means of which two persons who happened to eat the pottage made with such yeast died. So someone had poisoned the food that was given to the guests of Bishop John Fisher's household. It was certainly not a good image for Fisher, as he had invited starving people in off the streets, and they were now being poisoned. However, the two people who were killed by the poison were a gentleman named Bennet Curwen, who served in the household, and Alice Trippitt, a woman who had eaten the porridge and had become mortally infected. It was clear that Bishop John Fisher was the target of the poisoning plot, and fingers had been pointed towards Henry VIII being the one behind it, or Anne Boleyn and her family being involved, due to the resistance that the bishop had towards a king's new love. 17 people were violently ill and were sick, but Fisher had not eaten any of the food, as it's believed at the time he was fasting. He may also have accidentally employed the poorer people who were accepting the charity, in a sense as food tasters, as he would not usually eat until they had. But in the carnage inside of the bishop's home, Richard Roose, the cook, was nowhere to be seen. Suspicion very quickly turned towards the staff of the kitchen, and in particular Roose, and after a short chase, Richard Fisher, the brother of the bishop, arrested and apprehended him nearby. He was clearly trying to flee London, but when he was questioned, he was then taken to the Tower of London. Whilst inside of the tower, Roose was tortured on the infamous rack. He was strapped down on the device, and the cranks were turned, which stretched him limb from limb, and the pain was excruciating. Inside the tower, because of his torture, Roose would admit to placing what he thought was a laxative inside of the food, and he said it was a certain venom or poison, and he did admit he did this for a joke. He claimed that the substance would cause discomfort but would not kill, but the news of the poisoning plot went around London quickly, and there was a great fear amongst the wealthy people of the capital at the time because of this. Roose, it's believed, was Fisher's own cook, and he was the one who would personally prepare the bishop's meals on a daily basis. There was the possibility raised that he was persuaded to do this by someone else, and that someone else told him to poison the food, or provided him with the substance to do this. It's strange, as Roose's motivation to do it is not that clear, but the king was linked to the poisoning plot by Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis. The king was suspected of poisoning the bishop due to his rebelliousness with regards to Anne Boleyn. Some even said that the poor relations that the Boleyns had with Fisher was enough to make them culpable and likely to be blamed. But what was even more bizarre is the efforts Henry VIII went to cover up the poisoning and to deal with it. Roose would not be tried, and he would not get his chance to defend himself in front of a jury or the public. This meant that his story would never get out, and he would not implicate others, which led people to suspect King Henry VIII. The king would address the Lords of Parliament days later, and he told them at length about what had happened, and he would inform them about the incident, and how he deemed that he wanted to protect his subjects by having Richard Roose executed and condemned quickly for the crime. He was sentenced to death and was condemned based on what the king said rather than the evidence in front of a jury or a trial. But Henry even went further, and Roose, who was judged by Parliament, would also then face the fact he was now accused of treason. Henry VIII would change the laws of England and his realm to make sure that the crime of poisoning was considered treason, and with this he introduced a shocking execution method for those who were punishable for this sort of activity. It was said that the king in his speech, considering the man's life as above all things, is chiefly to be favoured, and voluntarily murder most highly to be detested and abhorred, and specifically all kinds of murders, poisoning, which in this realm hitherto the Lord, be thanked, he has the most rare and seldom seen, committed or practised. Henry said that the murder by poisoning was a new thing for England, and that because of this it deserved a very specific sentence to put people off, and an Act of Attainder was brought forward to condemn and sentence Richard Roose to death. The Act said, the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roose, for the said murder and poisoning of the said two persons, shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall therefore boiled to death, without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender deprived of his clergy and boiled to death. So Henry VIII altered the laws of his land to specifically state that Richard Roose, the man accused of poisoning the food of one of the king's enemies, should be killed by being boiled alive in front of a huge crowd. Boiling as an execution method was rare across England, and was only used a handful of times, but Richard Roose was left to rot inside of the Tower of London until his execution took place on the 15th of April 1532. But the execution of Richard Roose was a complete circus. It was clear that the king would symbolically believe that Roose being dipped into the vat of boiling water meant he was the poison being added to the food, almost mirroring his crime. But the execution began with Roose being taken by guards from his cell inside of the Tower of London to Smithfield, where he was marched towards the fire, where the boiling pot was found. A huge crowd was there. They were there to see the execution of the Tudor era. Crowds would flock to see entertainment and execution. They would believe that with this execution, that the king went too far, and many were sickened by what they saw. Richard Roose was tied in chains, and he was then placed into a gibbet, a large iron cage and frame, which was secured to a crane which could be lowered and hired. He was on display in front of the crowd, and underneath him was a large pot filled with boiling water. 3 times Richard Roose, the cook, was lowered in and out of the boiling water, each time screaming and screeching, until on the final time no sounds were made as he had died. Many of those who witnessed the execution were disgusted, and it was said, he roared mightily loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would definitely prefer to see the headsman at his work. But this would be the end of the story of Richard Roose, but it would not be the end of people wanting Bishop John Fisher dead. Shortly after the poisoning, a volley of gunfire from a cannon was shot through the roof of Bishop John Fisher's house randomly. He was inside his study at the time, and it's believed that the gunshot came from Thomas Boleyn's house. With this, Fisher knew that people wanted him dead, and Henry VIII would later get what he wanted, with Fisher executed on the 22nd of June 1535. Fisher lost his head on Tower Hill in front of a huge crowd, and many that day were greatly distressed by what they saw. But the execution of Richard Roose was one of the most harrowing of the Tudor period, and it showed the immense brutality of King Henry VIII. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.